office is to prepare students to become active global citizens through community service and democratic participation. We hold a lot of events through our office. We hold events like this, DEM 101, which is every week we alternate between 6 and 8 p.m. and 12 to 1 p.m. Every Wednesday throughout the semester. So we have held events in past weeks on media literacy, and we've held panels on PFAS in Michigan and all this kind of stuff. So look out for more events coming up this semester. We also have a podcast through our office called Be the Change. We actually had a new episode come out today. So if you head over to our website, gvsu.edu/service, you can listen to that, or if you guys have an idea for the podcast, you can also submit an idea on LakerLink. And then is anyone here for Lib 100 or 201? Yes, probably everyone, cool. So for other events that are through our office that are approved for Lib 100 and 201, we have our Days of Community Action this semester. We actually have one on Saturday, so if you guys need more events or want to go to that, we'll be going to Kids Food Basket in Holland. And that is this Saturday, and you can sign up through LakerLink. We also have our lovely Lib 100 and 201 mentors here, so if you guys need help going over what we talk about tonight, they are here to help you. So a bunch of information about all of our events and what we do in this office is on the table right outside where you guys checked in. There's a bunch of information out there, and also if you are not registered to vote, you can register to vote out there afterwards. Just holler at me or Melissa, raise your hand, and we can help you get registered to vote. So with that, we are going to begin. Our panel tonight is on student media and the role that student media plays in democratic engagement and participation. So I'm going to turn it over to my panelists real quick and ask them to introduce themselves and tell us your name, what organization, your title, all that fun stuff.
Hey everyone. Oh, is this working?
Yes.
Okay. It's just not like projecting.
Yeah, maybe just hold it.
Hello? Oh,
yeah.
There it is. Hi, I'm Eric Harvey. I'm an assistant professor in multimedia journalism, and I'm the faculty advisor for the Lanthorn.
Hello, I am Kyle Matchmay. I am the station manager for Grand Valley Television.
And hey, I'm Nick Moran. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Lanthorn.
So how did you guys all get involved with student media? We'll start out with that.
So I've been involved with student media since like high school.
Mm-hmm.
I was involved in my high school newspaper, which was the Oracle, back in the Chicagoland area where I'm from. And I knew that when I came to Grand Valley or wherever I went to college, I wanted to be involved in some sort of student media because it really played a big role in my high school career. And when I came here, the first thing I did was like find the Lanthorn's website and ask like, hey, how can I get involved? Because I need to do something. Through there, I did some arts reporting, news reporting, and then eventually took some leadership positions with the team and been there ever since.
I was very fortunate to have a very strong film department in my high school, so I took quite a few film classes, and when I came here as a film major, I knew I wanted some more experience, and so at Campus Life Night, I found GVTV. I went to the first meeting, and then I got very scared, and I did not come back for another semester, as I think we all know that feeling of being very overwhelmed and scared, but then rediscovering it, and that's just what I've been doing for the past 4 years.
I'm much older than everyone here. So my experience with student media started in college back in the mid-90s, where I wrote occasionally for my student paper, everyone's favorite college, Indiana University. And from there, after I graduated, I went and worked in the media industries for a while, worked in television and radio. And then I went back to graduate school, and I've been basically a working journalist ever since. So for probably about, I'd say going on 20 years now. And one of the great things about teaching at a university like this is being able to work with student groups on public-facing projects, I think is a good way to think about it. We put out one newspaper a week, and a print edition and a web edition, and just the opportunity to work with the students on this endeavor is a lot of fun. And so, yeah, I'll be doing it as long as they'll have me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this whole panel is on particularly student media. Do you guys maybe want to explain what is student media? What kinds of different outlets or venues can students use to produce media? And then how is that different than media outside of a university?
So the way I see student media, I think it's very similar to professional media. If you've been inside a student media newsroom specifically, I'll speak to my experience. It's a really robust experience where you have a lot of the same conversations about content, writing, editing. The whole process is just shrunk down, put inside a university. So it's no small feat. It's the readership is equatable to some small towns too. I mean, robust newspapers like the State News in Michigan do great reporting that has won awards and has, they've done work with Larry Nassar breaking that story too. That's had national impacts. So I think student media is, I'd say professional media shrunk down and localized with students in mind. I know a lot of the work that we do, I try to remind my editors, remember that your main audience is the campus community. So students, which also includes faculty members, staff, and even sometimes the surrounding community who's really invested in their local college. So student media is, I guess if I was to put it into one sentence, it is everything that a regular newspaper is, but shrunk down and personalized for the campus community.
I completely agree with everything that Nick just said. Student media is produced by students for not only students for a university, but also the faculty, the alumni, the geographic community that surrounds us. And what's interesting is with television, GVTV used to be very easy to get viewership because, 10, 20, 30 years ago, we had a direct line into every dorm on campus, and whenever people were bored and they wanted something to watch, we were right there. We're in 2019, so now we are competing your attention with YouTube and Hulu and Amazon and Netflix and a constant barrage of media and television coming in at you. So we need to find ways as we move forward to create content that is so very important to the students in terms of informing them of what's going on campus, in terms of relating to them and telling their stories that are important to us and important to what goes on around here, and less so the large global content that can be obtained pretty much on any other platform. So yeah.
Yeah, not much to add. I think these are both really good explanations of the role of student media. The only thing I will add is from a faculty perspective that, student media is really great because it gets you out of the classroom, you're creating a product, you're working in a professional environment that is based on the professional environments that you would be working in the future. And even if you're not working in a newsroom environment in the future or a television studio in the future, it gives you such great experience, I think, of working with a team, of creating a product, of collaborating, of having your ideas shot down, of having your ideas accepted, of taking constructive criticism, of realizing that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. I think there's so many reasons why student media is such a really useful and worthwhile thing to participate in. And the final thing is that as somebody who has been in student media as a student and who is now in student media as a faculty member, I think that the greatest thing about student media is it gives you a place to learn it gives you a place to screw up, right? Because, as somebody who's worked on projects with incredible six-figure budgets and the stress that goes with that, the idea that, if I would have at least had the idea to do something like this at a small scale before this, I would maybe have a little bit more preparation for this. But, the thing is with student media, and we don't screw up that often, but there is an opportunity here to kind of make mistakes that you're not going to be making in the professional world, to learn from your example, from others' examples, and occasionally from me kind of butting in and saying, hey, you might want to do this a different way next time. But I think that's the only thing I would add.
So what do you guys see as the role student media plays in democratic education and engagement? How is that, and how may that be different than the role that media outside of the university plays?
I think that all media does this, but I think student media has to prioritize this. And I've said this if you've talked to me outside this panel, student media is supposed to start a conversation. I know that with the content that we try and produce with the Lantern, if we get an email saying, hey, I want to address something that you guys published, we are thrilled. Even if someone that totally disagrees with maybe an editorial we published or some news coverage we had done, we love hearing feedback and we love having more conversations, you know. Seeing people that not only have our newspaper in their hands, but are talking with the person next to them or have it in front of them when they're talking across from a table is key, because there are issues that oftentimes are overlooked. And I think especially with student media, again, where we have this close, localized community that we kind of have a pulse on, we can deliver news that will get people talking. And when people start talking, good things happen, because oftentimes people think that they're alone. And when they turn to a newspaper and they see people telling stories or sharing ideas, they are inspired and encouraged to come out and say, hey, you know, that's me too. So I think that if a student newspaper especially, or a student TV station or radio station sparks conversations, gets people talking, I think that's a key role, or it plays a key role in addressing issues and potentially even finding solutions. Even though we're not proposing them, we're facilitating that conversation.
Absolutely, like, you know, and agreeing with that. When we have the capability with GVTV for bringing those conversations and those discussions and those events to you, almost as if you're in the room with them. We have a live stream here for all of our Democracy 101 events that you guys can always access as students on our online channels. Back in 2016, when we had a number of Republican and Democratic events that were being held on campus, or at least in the surrounding Grand Rapids area, we had broadcasters there to provide students access, because those events are very important, because the representatives of them are talking directly to students and about student issues and things that are important to us. And if those events, you can't attend them, or if you aren't able to access them, or maybe the event is completely full and sold out, that will still be documented and available for you to access and see as both historical documentation is also a way to connect with what was being told at that time. And we're very happy that we can provide that service.
Yeah, I think just to build upon these two ideas is that democracies require voices, and voices require platforms. And in order to be heard and at their best, I think media organizations can serve as that platform for voices on the margins, for voices toward the center. I think to be heard and to have their thoughts heard and their feelings, and to participate in a robust public sphere. And so I think that, you know, at our best, you know, and we can always get better, you know, we want to invite more participants into this discussion. I think, you know, the best thing that our newspaper or our television radio station can do is to serve as a platform. I think to allow voices to be heard, to allow coverage of events, to reach audiences, to inform people of things that they might not be aware of or they might not have been able to attend or see. And I think that, you know, at its core, you know, if you're going to have a functioning democratic society, you have to provide those outlets, and I mean, especially in the news world now. I mean, not in, you know, we're facing a moment where, you know, the economic basis of those outlets is being threatened by a lot of factors, and so it's important to support them and to ensure their survival.
I think in the same vein too, accountability is a big thing too, because to be perfectly honest, as students, academics are always our first priority. You know, we're trying to get out of here in 4, 5, 6 years. We're trying to get out into the field. Yeah, you know, it's got to be safe. And we're busy people. There's not often that we're going to sit down and say, hey, I'm going to carve out 2-3 hours to attend a student senate, faculty senate, board of trustees meeting on my Friday, Thursday night when I could be doing homework or studying for a test or even taking time to, you know, enjoy myself. I think that that's a key role that student media plays as well. Who's going to be holding your university accountable when you're paying, you know, thousands of dollars to be here? Someone has to be keeping an eye on what's going on, because you have a lot more power than you'd think, with not only the power to vote through democracy, but the power to even fund a public institution like this. So making sure that keeping an eye on your student media and having them provide news that may not be something you agree with, you can come out and have those conversations. You can speak with your wallet, with your vote, whatever it may be. But having that knowledge is key to making a difference.
And so what have you guys observed both at GVSU at large and within your respective organizations in terms of the climate around democratic engagement, and how do those observations play out at your respective media outlets, both with your audiences and with your student employees?
Well, I think one thing that we do is we maintain a good sort of working relationship with Student Senate, with the Board of Trustees, with the sort of higher ups at the university, in order to sort of hold them to account, like Nick was saying, to kind of ask the questions that I think students would want asked of the powers that be at the university, whether at the student level or at the administrative level or at the trustee level, and then also to sort of represent the sort of work that they're doing back to the student body, to sort of report on what they're doing. I think in one specific way, that's a sort of a democratic service that we provide.
Yeah, I mean, I'll totally agree. I think that it kind of piggybacks what I was saying before, is that people need to be in the know. When we ask ourselves, okay, what's the story here? We're asking what's relevant to our community that we serve. You know, we're acting as this middleman, relaying information both from the student body or the community to the, let's say the higher ups, or from forms of governments or leadership all the way down. We're telling stories that are supposed to keep people in the loop so they can make informed decisions as students, voters, whatever it may be.
And that's what's so important about the fact that we're on a university that is in West Michigan, and I think if you go just a couple miles in any direction, you're going to find radically different cultures and experiences and voters and with different issues than we have. And so that's why it's so important. We have this large body of students, of individuals living here in Allendale or in Grand Rapids, and they need to have a voice too. And so it's our responsibility to make sure that that voice is heard as well as informed as possible.
What do you guys, what have you noticed? Like, have you gotten any feedback from your readers or your viewers about maybe certain projects that you've done or organizations that you've worked with, just in terms of like how they're engaging with that information?
Yeah, trying to think of specific examples. This is only my first semester, so I haven't seen too much kind of firsthand information. But yeah, you guys.
Yeah, so we had 3 years ago, I know that GVTV was doing a live broadcast of the Donald Trump Jr. rally that was being held in the second floor of Kirchhoff. And I remember, I wasn't an active part of GVTV at that time, but I remember that we had some pushback, people not being happy with the fact that we were giving a platform to a voice that some saw as maybe being disrespectful or inciting hate in any way. And so that was something that GVTV had to deal with. And I wasn't a part of those discussions, but it's an important discussion to have in terms of who you give a platform to and what voices are that should be heard. And that's just a question that we should be asking ourselves. And I don't actually have an answer for that, but it is important for us to discuss those things.
I'll say, given my time as a student journalist, I've experienced that there are people in this world that have kind of a shoot the messenger experience with media. When we're trying to give voice to those who we think deserve it, oftentimes people think that we totally agree with what's being said, whereas I think that the role of journalists, especially student journalists, is to, again, give voice and to have conversation. I know that I personally covered the Donald Trump rally in Grand Rapids last year, and that was an experience, let me tell you. Walking around downtown, obviously being media, whether you have a camera or voice recorder, is one thing. But also when you post the story and you see people commenting on Facebook or on our website, saying things like, I can't believe this was covered, or why would you give voice to someone that spreads so much hate? And understanding, I think part of tackling that is understanding that you're doing the best job you can, because if someone's taking time to write a comment, that means that they're reading your work and they have something to say, which means that it's important that you covered it. So at the end of the day, that's what I think that our role is related to, especially political issues like that.
So I'll add one thing kind of in general. speaking of the current political climate, we have a president now who is kind of purposefully dismantling a lot of the norms that had developed around the relationship between journalists and elected officials, refusing to give comments, not holding press conferences, sort of in many ways like speaking in a way that is directly offensive to many groups of people. And journalists across the spectrum, professional and academic, have had to think about the concept of what we in journalism call newsworthiness. What makes something newsworthy? And for this might be a discussion that we might want to have, because journalists are still having it today, where when you have a president who is saying explicitly hateful things and is making explicitly hateful legislation part of his platform, is covering that reality, feeding in or giving a platform to a hateful ideology, or is it inherently newsworthy because the president did it? So for decades, for more than a century, right, anything the president did was inherently newsworthy because they were the president. And we like to think that still matters, but then at the same time, we've never had a president like the one that we have now. We've never had a president who kind of dismisses many of the norms of the relationship, not only between the press and the president, but the president and the country as a whole. And so, I don't think it's coincidental at all that we're talking about Trump-related things when we're talking about getting pushback or feedback from various constituencies that see coverage of rallies with laden with hate speech and threatening gestures to be themselves kind of feeding into a bad climate in American democratic life. I think that's a very valid conversation to have, and I 100% understand why the average citizen might look at this, especially folks from marginalized groups are looking at coverage of Trump rallies and saying, is it necessary to give this such a large platform when so much that's coming out right now is purely hate? It's a valid question.
Yeah, so it seems like maybe our political atmosphere right now is one of the biggest issues and challenges to journalism today. Would you guys agree with that? Or would you say there's any other big challenges to facing that journalists face when it comes to democracy?
Yeah, I can start, but yeah, journalism has never necessarily been a 100% robust, crisis-free institution. It's gone through its own kind of ebbs and flows over time. Newspaper journalism, where I come from, has really been on a decline since its peak in the mid-1980s. I mean, we're looking at about 30 years of a slow decline here because of television, cable TV, the rise of the internet, et cetera. The biggest kind of factor now that's adding into problems that journalists are having, kind of maintaining a robust public sphere and maintaining jobs for journalists who are acting in the public interest, is ownership. It's an economic problem right now, because a lot of what's happening is that because journalism relied on advertising dollars for so long, and now all the advertising dollars online have been sucked up by Facebook and Google, journalistic platforms are either kind of going out of business, newspapers are going out of business, or they're being bought up by, to be frank, shady hedge fund managers who are looking to wring as much money out of them as they can, fire people, and move on to the next victim, so to speak. I mean, this is happening right now at many newspapers across the country. And so I think that when Trump got elected, Trump came of age in a New York tabloid culture in which he could feed the press information about himself. And get that press fed back to him. I grew up watching it happen. And that's what he's doing now. He wants to feed press information about himself that is flattering to himself and get that reflected back. And when he gets pushback, he blames the press. And what that is creating is this sort of dark sort of feeling around journalism as, right, whatever you want to call it, fake news or dishonest, lying press, et cetera. But what Trump is doing now is not necessarily new. All politicians hate the press. That's kind of the point, because all politicians want to remain in power, and the press's job is to hold them to account. But what President Trump did was he really kind of walked into a tinderbox and flicked the match in it. And so I think that, you know, a lot of what we're looking at now, I mean, at the university level, I mean, what is a university other than a laboratory to learn how to be a good citizen down the road in your adult life, right? This is where you can screw up. This is where you make friends. This is where you socialize, where you learn how to live on your own, manage your own life, kind of learn what you're interested in, learn about the world around you in this sort of, not quite a cocoon, but kind of a bubble, right? And student journalism fits right in the middle of that. Student media fits right in the middle of that. And so we're not isolated at all from these larger currents that are going on in the public sphere, especially the sort of, you know, the most kind of sinister elements at the highest level of American politics, I think.
If that tinderbox that you referred to earlier that had the match light into it, I think the majority of that tinderbox is constructed out of, I guess, the internet. I think a lot of the product of the developments we've seen in terms of journalism, in terms of broadcast television, and in terms of politics is with the introduction of this new high-speed communication platform that allows us to receive all the information at once, which means we need to find out which forms of information we want to select and do, and whether that be different online platforms or even on a single platform, whether you allow your Twitter feed to be dominated by a single ideology that can just come into a bubble that you reinforce, whether that be on Twitter or Reddit or any other online platform where you decide to get your news, where you decide to have your opinions reinforced and maybe instead of challenged. It's much easier to have your opinion not be challenged when you are, let's say, online searching for the opinions you want to see rather than something in a less biased newspaper platform or a broadcast television. And of course, biases have always existed, but they're a lot easier to define when you're online. And so I think that that's an important part of why we've seen this development over the past few years. I think it's just a product of everyone having access to all the information that they want to observe rather than what is being maybe filtered to them.
Wow, those were two great answers. I have to follow that up. I'm going to say that right now, as a student journalist, it's an intimidating time to look into your future profession as a journalist. You have a rampant distrust in media with this whole fake news culture, competition for jobs and a shrinking industry. And you have citizen journalism on the rise where, because of the smartphones in our pocket, anyone can post what they think is news and people will believe them. Online blogs where people can post opinion over fact and people consider that news because it favors their stance is intimidating. And what that does is it breaks down our democracy. You've heard it before, but people consider journalism kind of the fourth branch of government, the structure that makes people, holds people accountable and keeps the citizens informed so that they can elect the right people into power. I think that when we're looking at our current political system right now, there's a lot of room to be a scared journalist. Mm-hmm. And what we're breeding right now with our current system is really, really journalists who aren't afraid to roll up their sleeves. It's a difficult time to be a very passive journalist, one that's not asking hard questions. If you want to work for a really cutting edge news industry, you have to be fearless. You have to be not afraid of people looking you in the eye and saying, "Hey, I don't believe what you're saying," and you can look right back at them and say, "Hey, well, here's my sourcing. I've double checked all my notes. The work is robust and it stands on its own." I think that we're in this, status or the state in our current society where, it's tough to be a journalist, but we really need to push back on all of the issues that we kind of have highlighted right now, all the problems that we have with our work right now, and say at the end of the day, if you erase journalism from, the history books right now, what would be left? Social media posts, personal blogs, legitimate fake news?
So education does play a big role in how engaged we are with our democracy, both as journalists and as consumers of news. What do you think that we gain by becoming educated on issues around democracy? So that's voting, politics, government, civil discourse, all that kind of stuff. in college rather than later on in life.
I'll give it a shot. I think that the great thing about college students, and not to brag because I am one, is that we're a really like rowdy bunch. You know, we're not afraid to get our hands dirty and to speak loudly and proudly and be bold. So I think that when it comes to educating ourselves, and busting preconceptions that we might have had embed implicitly in our minds, we're not afraid to go, wow, that sucks that I learned it that way. I'm not afraid to change things now. We're a really motivated group. We're a really inspirational group. I think that when you promote learning about things like democracy, media literacy, being an active participant in our democracy, I think that it doesn't fall on deaf ears in most cases. I think that at the end of the day, as much as we have a lot of stuff going on, if you ask us to mobilize or get behind a cause we believe in, the majority of college students will do that, which makes us a really powerful force to be reckoned with.
I think an incredible benefit of higher education such as this at Grand Valley State University and a lot of universities is that we become critical thinkers. And critical thinking is so very important right now. When I said before, we have all of this information being thrown in front of us, and we need to challenge everything that we see, unfortunately, and we need to decipher what are the intentions behind this that's being brought to my attention, and is this a reliable source? So when LeBron James asks us to be more educated on what is going on in the situations in Hong Kong and China, that's an excellent example of maybe all of us needing to challenge why he is saying that, why we should be becoming invested, and what are the motivations that are going on there. So that is what's really valuable about all of our education, and the environments of discussion and challenging our preconceived notions is that we can become critical thinkers and apply it to every situation that comes in front of us and why it is being brought to our attention.
No, I think those are both absolutely terrific answers, and the only thing I can add is, again, being in college, like I was saying earlier, I really do think that it is best sort of equated to a laboratory where you can sort of experiment with a lot of different ways of being. I mean, I look back at when I was in college and I look at my freshman year and my senior year, and I compare those two people, and they are two pretty different people. And thankfully, that second person was better than the first person. I didn't get worse. But the person that I ended up, as a senior, I mean, obviously you grow exponentially after that. But I think that, the thing that I understood, that I think I learned the most in college is that you learn as much out of class as you learn in class. And you learn, I think the biggest thing that I learned is that everything is political. Nothing is not political. We like to think that politics is this thing where you vote and, once every 4 years or once every 2 years, or that politics are things that politicians do. And that's what a lot of people would like you to believe. They would like a sort of reticent populist, but I don't think that works at all. I think it's very easy to kind of sit back and kind of let things go. Entertainment is great. We all love entertainment, but at the same time, I think both Nick and Kyle are very on point thinking, or by saying that we need to be critical analysts of the world around us. We need to question why things are happening. That doesn't mean you have to grab a placard and go march. But I think that the thing that college gives you so much, and that student media can kind of really distill, is the ability to understand how power works, right? Why are things coming at us in the way that they are? Why are things happening the way that they are? There's always a reason, and it's always going to boil down to a contestation in some way over power. One person wants their view to be held versus the status quo, or versus another person's opinion. And so I think that that's really one of the most important things that you can do sort of in your 4 or 5 or 6, right? I was 4.5, right, years in college. And just one last thing, when I talk about journalism to non-journalists, I like to say, I did a PhD, and I did a PhD because the thing I like to do more than anything else in the world is to just dive up to my eyeballs in information and just kind of wallow in it. The research, right, is so much fun to me. I love learning as much as I can about a topic and then turn that knowledge into something public, right? To say, I've spent X amount of time, right, learning as much as I can, stuffing as much knowledge into my head about a particular topic as I can, and now my job, my skill, my talent is flipping that into something that the average person can understand, right? That is the core of journalism, right, is to say these people who do journalism, that's their job. They fill a particular role in society to observe events, to do research, and to learn as much as they can about a topic, and sometimes on a quick deadline, sometimes on a longer deadline. I write books, you know, books take years to write, but I like to say at the end of that book that I am the expert on this particular thing that I've done, and now this is in the world, and this is helping people understand maybe a small corner of the world, maybe a larger corner of the world, it depends. But the idea is, I don't think there's any more noble pursuit for the individual, not for the society, and hopefully for society as a whole, is to take in as much knowledge about something that's meaningful to you and meaningful to society, and then put that back out with your educated spin on it. I think that's what journalists do, and I think that's what can really help us understand not just the sort of, you know, branches of government idea of democracy, but the broadest idea of civic engagement and democratic life, which is that everything does boil down to people wanting to get things done for specific reasons, understanding what those reasons are, and speaking out when you disagree with them.
So obviously, the point, I think you guys mentioned this, the point of higher education is to learn, is to become those critical thinkers. And certainly we get some of that inside the classroom, but what do you think is the kind of role that a journalist plays in that type of education? Like, what's the balance between education in the classroom and education from student media?
I can start, but I think that the biggest thing that you get from student media is the thing that you will get from any kind of organization that you're participating in outside of class, which is, again, the idea of working with a group to do something bigger than yourself, building camaraderie, learning how to kind of participate in an activity as an adult in which your opinion is often not the most important thing in the world, but it kind of factors into something that's larger than everyone else. And I think, again, I will say, right, as somebody who's spent the last 25 years of his life in higher education, that I learned more outside of the classroom in college than I did inside the classroom. A lot of that was self-directed. A lot of that was doing stupid crap when I was in undergrad and learning from my mistakes. And a lot of it was just kind of socializing with people who were different from me and learning from them, not pushing them away, but bringing them in and kind of saying, why do I disagree with this person? What do I have to learn from this person's experiences that are different from mine? That was really sort of what made me, I think, a more holistically kind of educated person.
Eric answered this question earlier, and I'll expand on it, is that what student media allows you to do is to see the ramifications of mistakes that you can make in a somewhat controlled and safe environment. We had a news segment last year that was touching on some aspects of global climate change. And at the very end of it, we reevaluated the video that we had made, the episode we had made, and we said, wait, a lot of the facts that we had put in here, while they were in line in terms of the ideology or in terms of the perception the scientific community has on the issue of global climate change, the actual facts themselves were not accurate. And we had a responsibility not to air that piece, even though it was the end conclusion was in line with the scientific community, the actual facts weren't. And that was a really strong learning process for our team, was to realize their responsibility, because if we had let that go out there and we let that false information go out there, we would have been responsible for that. Now in a classroom, you make that mistake, you get a bad grade. You know, you don't actually feel the actual the guilt or ramifications of getting something wrong. And that's what our team was able to experience and learn from. And that's what's so amazing about student media, is it gives you that platform to fail in a somewhat controlled and safe environment, and to learn from those and prepare yourself for a professional environment where those mistakes can cost you big time.
And I agree. I think learning's the key word here. I think most of us here are students or have been students at one point in their lives. during your time at college, I think a key part of the experience here is learning about who you are, what your values are, what you believe in. That's what really makes you the person who you are down the road. It's a really important, I think, foundation for the rest of your life. Now that we're college students and we've kind of discovered what our beliefs are through different classes or extracurriculars, you ask, okay, so what now? What's my goal here? What's the end goal here? What am I going to do now that I have found my core principles and beliefs? How do I apply them and make some change in the world? Well, look at a newsstand, and there's plenty of opportunities for you to get involved with different groups around campus, hold elected officials accountable with having an informed vote. I think we oftentimes hear that, being an active voter is one thing, but being an informed voter is another thing. And making sure that when you cast your vote, you're not just looking for a D or an R next to someone's name, but you're actually fundamentally agreeing with them. Now that you've, through college have discovered who you are and what your beliefs are, using resources like the media to hold people accountable. And if you see someone doing stuff that you don't agree with, you have a resource that you can turn to say, hey, this goes against these beliefs I've now developed. Let's do something about it,
Yeah. So we'll wrap up this portion pretty quickly here, but I just maybe if each of you want to, in 1 or 2 sentences, just wrap us up by saying really what we've talked about a lot, the importance of having those kind of hard discussions about media and democracy, but why is that so important? What are the larger implications of those conversations?
So I've mentioned it briefly before. Anyone here can be a journalist, in a sense. Again, we have high-powered phones in our pockets that can record audio and take photos, and we have the largest platform in the world being social media to disseminate that information. So now that you kind of have a glimpse into what we do professionally, educate yourselves, because you can be an important change in the world as well. If you look at the Rapidian, it's a outlet right here in Grand Rapids that is a nonprofit that's done by it's a hyper-local news coverage done by local journalists. If you look at people online, especially on Twitter, is like the hub for journalists on social media. Some folks on there are just people who happen to stumble upon information. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to report ethically? Are you going to do something that spurs conversation? Or are you going to withhold that information and share it in a way that's not very responsible? I think that when people look at journalists, sometimes we're kind of in our own bubble, in our own cage, but realize that you have the opportunity to have the exact same impact that we do.
As citizens, we have the capability of voting for multiple levels of government: local, state, federal. And of course, all of those branches are very important, but sometimes there is more attention given to a national stage than the local stage. And the local stage is incredibly important because that is probably where you're going to get the most impact as a citizen, as an individual living in that area. Local laws and local regulations that will have the most direct impact on you. And that's why small newspapers or television stations or broadcasts of information can be so helpful, because they will help better inform you on the local issues that are going on directly in your life than the national news organizations that can give a larger national perspective. Both are important, but sometimes we put more weight on the national stage than the local, and the local is incredibly important as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that Kyle just made there. Since Trump has been elected, certain journalistic outlets, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, have just seen their revenue skyrocket, right? Because they're hiring new journalists to cover the most corrupt presidency in American history. Local journalism at the same time is in crisis mode. And this is the actual space where the most corruption, the most ill-gotten gains are kind of transpiring. I mean, if you knew that you could do your job without anybody paying necessarily attention to you, how much bad stuff would you try to get away with, right? Whether it's kind of, stealing office supplies all the way up to, misappropriating taxpayer funds, right? The hyper-local and the local level of journalism is right now what we need to be focusing on. But even kind of broader than that, The idea of, the thing that I was told early on in my college career as an undergraduate was to try. Like that's the biggest thing that I learned kind of as, a person who thought that he wanted to kind of do something. Was not to, the instinct can be, right, and we all have our individual stresses, we all have things that kind of stop us from doing as much as we want to do, but we also know when we're phoning it in, right, and, especially when you're paying to kind of go to college, right, and especially when you're here, with a particular goal in mind, giving the bare minimum. To me, it's not something that I would necessarily want to look back on my time in college and think, oh yeah, I did the absolute bare minimum. I got by, C's get degrees, et cetera, right? But you hear that a lot, right? I'm here because I'm supposed to be here. And one thing I learned in college is that, the example I give to my students is I took 3 years of French in college, right? I wish I would have taken Spanish. Would have been a lot more useful. I took 3 years of French in college, and I phoned it in, right? I was like, I have to take this because it's a necessity to get this thing for my degree, right? Yada, yada. Got like B's and C's and in my classes. And I was thinking if I would have just paid a little bit more attention, I would be more or less fluent in a foreign language right now for doing nothing other than getting a basic requirement of a humanities degree out of the way. And I look back and I regret that, I said, I could be able to kind of be fluent and kind of walking through the streets of Paris right now, talking to people for doing nothing else than just going to class and paying attention more. And I have zero doubt about that, and, giving the least amount, leaving early, walking out, kind of phoning it in, I think is not, it's often the easy way to do it, but it's also, I think that if you look back, especially at college, but also kind of in your life, and you think, could I have done more there? Could I have kind of put forth a little bit more effort, kind of helped other people out, gave something a little bit more? I think that you do regret that when you realize that, no, I was kind of phoning it in, and today literally it's often phoning it in, right? I fall prey to that as well. But I think that at the core level, not just in college but in life, giving the absolute least possible effort is it's often the easiest. It's always the easiest thing to do, but it's never the most rewarding thing to do.
All right, so thank you guys for answering all of my questions, but now I want to turn to our audience. So you guys have these big pieces of paper in front of you, so you'll need to get together in groups, so maybe the 2 of you, 3 of you, and then you 2 back there. On your pieces of paper, we're going to take probably about 5 minutes. You need to make a list of a few things that you learned from our panelists, and then a few questions of things you still want to know, a few questions that we can ask our panelists. So take about 5 minutes in your groups and kind of discuss those things. Okay.
you just want me to say what we learned first and the questions after? Or
You can
that
just
what-
do what you learned first, and then we'll
Okay.
answer questions in a little bit.
So we put down 2 things, and first we put that there is a very high importance of educating yourself about the world around you, as in not spreading the fake news and seeking out reliable news sources. And then we also said don't be afraid to ask the difficult questions.
Yeah, good. Pass it over.
We said that student media starts a conversation. You got to go out there and like try to learn stuff and not just like phone it in. And then like the importance of student media, like what makes us critical thinkers, and what holds us accountable for the news we couldn't be present for.
I'll let you go.
So we didn't play by the rules.
Okay.
Surprise,
Shocker, Melissa.
surprise. So rather than kind of looking at what we learned and what we still want to know, we just kind of reflected on some of what we were listening to. And we talked about, let's see if we can sum this up. We talked about the way or the role that media plays in either, and maybe this isn't a dichotomy, but either creating kind of a shared understanding of the world, or, and I guess I was referring back to, when I was a kid, it was Channel 3, Channel 8, or Channel 13 news, and the newspaper. And, there was just a common understanding. There was a common set of facts. And I'm not saying that that's inherently a good thing. It just was, it felt like the ground underneath you was somewhat more stable. And so we were talking about how, I said to Wesley, like, sometimes I wonder if we're literally standing on the same ground. So if I'm someone who comes from, a rural area and I'm not college educated and my news source is, Fox News, and I'm super generalizing here, I'm going to be looking at, an event or an issue with a very different lens than someone who is college educated and reading the New York Times and living in an urban area. And so we were just talking about, actually Wesley had a really great example. Yeah.
So earlier today, I was doing research. I was watching the Netflix film When They See Us, and I was doing research on it and doing research on the prosecuting attorney and the DA. So it was an article from the Wall Street Journal, had a different perspective when it came to the documentary. It had where it gave praise to the DA and the prosecuting attorney because of her amazing work, and her work as being the first sex crime division in the whole country. And, compared to the Netflix documentary where you see it where it was portraying where young black males was portrayed as victims and suspects, portrayed as suspects to a crime. It doesn't matter what the description was, all black teens in that park was suspect. And another article basically said that, we forgive her, for this and whatnot. And these are some New York Times, Wall Street Journal, articles and stuff. So different reality and different perspective depending on, where you come from.
Yeah, so, and I don't know that everyone's familiar with the case that Wesley's talking about. When They See Us is a film by Ava DuVernay that talks about the trial of the Central Park Five. So anyway, it was just a matter of like what elements of the story are being highlighted by these different outlets. The more conservative, right-leaning Wall Street Journal is highlighting these great accomplishments of this, DA. Whereas Ava DuVernay, who is looking at the experience from the perspective of these exonerated 5 young black men, is saying, well, yeah, that's great, but what about, why are we highlighting that when she is responsible for imprisoning these 5 innocent young men? So like, even the same story can be told, and this is not news, but the same story can be told in two very different ways. So how the heck do we find literally like the same ground that we're standing on?
And I would think that's probably conversations that journalists, student journalists and journalists in the field right now are having. Do you guys, have you guys had those conversations maybe either, thank you, in the classroom or in your newsrooms?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you're, first off, I think one of the big misconceptions about journalists is that they are objective, right? Whenever I talk about journalism, teaching journalism, I'm writing a book on the concept of reality right now. But whenever I talk to people about it, they say, oh, well, you know, nothing's really, you know, it's not objective anymore, right? And my response is like, well, it never was, right? I mean, journalists are human beings with feelings and emotions and connections to truth that just like anybody else. And, you know, if you are a working journalist, right? So we had a journalist, a student, Audra Gamble, who used to edit The Lanthorn, who is now working for the Holland Sentinel. And she came back and talked to some of our classes about the fact that that one thing, like not surprisingly, that college didn't prepare her for in the real world was covering murders, covering deaths, and seeing these things with your eyes for the first time as a representative of a publication that is responsible for covering it. Seeing a dead body for the first time is it's a thing, right? And you can't just imagine that you're not going to have some sort of emotional reaction to it, right? And that's a really kind of sharp example. But at the same time, I think with a case like the Central Park 5, it's easy, especially in the social media era, if something like this happens, it's easy for the next couple days of controversy to kind of bubble over on social media. And I often advise people to kind of tune out, right? It's just like let people get these emotions out and before we can start kind of seeking the truth. But what I would say actually, you know, to the distinction between somebody at the Wall Street Journal and then somebody like Ava DuVernay is this is a power question, right? So this is the Wall Street Journal siding with the person in the institution that has the most infrastructural power. You know, you have a prosecutor or a DA versus people who, you know, legitimately are some of the least powerful in American society. You know, young black men, especially young black men in urban areas. And so I think that, you know, again, by looking at sort of, you know, a lot of times journalists say follow the money, right? I say you can, it's like, who are you siding with, right? And so most stories, I would argue, don't have such clear sides, right? You know, a trial, you do have defendants and plaintiffs, but and you have guilty and innocent, but I think a lot of stories really are nebulous. I don't think the Central Park 5 case is one of these, but I do think that when you look at who people are siding with, I think it, you know, it can be clear when it's like, oh, I'm siding with the cops over the victims, right? Or I'm siding with the cops over, you know, somebody that doesn't necessarily have as strong of a voice. And as somebody who's been a journalist for a while, I say that it's important to have opinions. It's important to have informed opinions, and it's important to have those opinions echo through public discussion on cases like this, because without those opinions, I think the Central Park 5 kids might be in a different situation right now.
I can't speak much in terms of a newsroom, and our news department is still very small, and we don't have to deal with a lot of these discussions very often. But there was a New York senator from somewhere between 1980 to 2003, and they were on the Senate floor. And he was discussing a topic that was important to him, and then there was another senator from the other side of the aisle, and they were getting into an exchange, and the other senator said, because he was getting a little frustrated, and says, oh, well, that's just your opinion, and I have my opinion, so we'll just leave it at that. And this senator, this Democratic senator from New York said, sir, you are entitled to your opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And so let's make sure that our opinions are based off of those facts. And so that just kind of goes off of what Harvey said in terms of we need to be making sure where our opinions are coming from, and are they based off of other opinions, or are they based off of the facts at hand, and where are we getting those opinions from?
So I want to touch on that point that you folks in the back discussed, that if you took two different people and they were raised on two different news platforms, they'd be two entirely different types of folks, right? We live in a day and age where if you want to find a news outlet that fits with your preconceived beliefs and notions, you can find it, whether it be on the left, the right, or anything in between. And funny enough, the same thing happens when we look at actual sources of information. Even in like high school, middle school, we're taught to, very early, your first step for finding good information is looking for a .org website. And then you move up and you look for peer-reviewed sources, and you're trying to find credible sources, and when you're writing persuasive papers especially, sources that back your stance, right? Even with global warming, we're looking at politicians pulling niche reports, things that might not be validated, that just support their stance. They don't stand on their own, right? We're looking at a news industry right now which has outlets on the left and the right, and you can kind of find a news report that takes your stance, even without reading the the full piece. You can look at the headline and where it comes from to kind of determine what the slant of that piece is going to be. I think that we need to start teaching media literacy inside schools as much as we teach research literacy. Finding a balance in your coverage. I think that when we're looking at one news source as like my news source, so I get my news from CNN or Fox or MSNBC, that's half the battle. I mean, you guys are doing great work right now by taking yourselves in a media literacy discussion. You're learning about how the newsroom works and where the flaws are. I think Professor Harvey put it right. I mean, objectivity is not something that ever existed. We can strive for perfection all we want, but recognizing that we're far from perfect, even though we try to be there, it is part of the battle we fight every day. And it's your jobs as citizens, holding up your end of the bargain, holding us accountable, and looking, double checking your facts, not taking everything we say at face value. We try our hardest, but at the end of the day, nobody's perfect.
Can I add one thing to that? Not all, how can I phrase this diplomatically? Not all sides of arguments or debates are equivalent. Some people are full of BS. Some people, right? So in the journalism world right now, we're dealing with climate change, right? It used to be called global warming. Now it's called climate change. And there's been a lot of discussions in the industry about how do you talk about people who refuse to accept the scientific consensus that human beings are adding more carbon to the atmosphere, which is doing, in many ways, irreversible damage to our climate. 97, 98% of global climate scientists agree on this fact. And there's a word that's kind of emerged in journalistic fields called both-sidesism. Both-sidesism is this idea that everything you talk about has to have two sides, and the two sides, more importantly, are equally weighted. And you get, when journalists, right, and this is rooted in this myth of objectivity, that everything has to have this sort of scalar balance, which is not true. Something like climate change, it is a scientific fact. Journalists work in very similar ways to scientists, right? We go out and we empirically find information. We verify that information by talking to multiple people who are at the scene of something, people who are experts on it, right? And then we put it out into the world, right? And then what happens is if that story is important, other journalists go at it and verify what you've done. This is what scientists do too. Can I replicate your experiment in my laboratory, right? Journalists do this, right? This is a good faith activity, right? Journalists are wrong all the time, but the thing that's important here is that journalists strive to correct themselves. They correct the record because they realize that it's important to have the annals of human history kind of reflecting a truthful consensus to the degree that that's possible. But this idea that all debates have to have two equally weighted sides allows so many bad faith actors to emerge to fill that side, to fill the other side, right? So you get stories about hate crimes, and then you're like, am I supposed to have somebody who represents hate speak about like the hateful side of this story? It's like, you know, that's an extreme example, but this is the sort of idea that it leads to. It's like, no, of course not, right? If we have some sort of ethical or values basis to what we're talking about. And so for a while there was a discussion in the news industry. What do you call people who don't believe in climate change, right? So for a while, the AP actually was saying, the Associated Press, who determines the language for a lot of daily newspapers, says climate skeptics, right? And a lot of scientists, not even journalists, scientists came out and said, excuse me, skeptics, right? Like, you can be skeptical about something. It's like, are you skeptical about gravity? Are you skeptical, right? It's like, no, you're climate deniers, right? And so the AP actually changed its language to reflect, you know what, while of course we have to have, you know, television news, no shots, right? You're not a television news guy. Cable television news has really sort of infected the public discourse in just a really terrible way in this regard, where everything has to have representatives from both sides. And it really just kind of massively distorts a lot of issues by presenting sides that are, if not populated by bad faith actors who are either taking money from lobbyists to represent something, right, polluters, et cetera, or they're just in there kind of like Reddit folks or 4chan folks just to kind of muck up the discourse and kind of, you know, do it for the lulz, right? It really opens it up to that. And so one of the things that I always like to say, and this is the hardest kind of thing that journalists have to talk about, especially to kind of average folks. I always use my parents, for example, right, is, you know, trying to talk about issues that people have been trained for generations to think, oh, well, there's always two sides to the issue. And it's like, no, some issues really are settled, right? And the only reason that they continue to be kind of generative in terms of news coverage is that there are people who want this to continue to be an unsettled debate, right? Because usually there are people who are often fairly obvious, who are at risk of losing a lot of money or a lot of power if this debate is viewed as settled. So if you take one thing away from me, not these two scholars, but from me, it's that don't assume that when somebody says there are two sides to an issue that both sides need to be equally weighted. We are smarter than that. We can rationalize past that. I think that's one thing to take away.
So maybe like one question from these two groups up here, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. You guys want to go first?
I mean, yeah, we didn't really have that much, but what do you think is the most difficult thing when it comes to being involved in student media?
Most important thing?
Difficult.
Oh, difficult. Oh, wow.
Man, good question. I think that a fear or being fearless of failure is a big thing. Mm-hmm. That's something that you really have to learn. There are a lot of things that can be taught, but having some sort of audacity or daringness to do something that hasn't been done before, ask a question that hasn't been asked before, is really, really scary, and that's probably the most difficult thing. I know that there are projects that I have worked on in the past or am working on now, where I've asked myself, why the heck am I doing this, and who am I going to anger by doing this, or is this going to be wrong? And I think that that's probably the most difficult part of the job, is taking that self-doubt and turning it into, okay, you know, there's a chance that I could mess things up. How am I going to mitigate that chance? You know, can I put the work in to ask better questions, or, you know, double check my sources? I think that is a really hard thing that journalists have to overcome, and it comes with time and experience, but I don't think it ever really goes away, at least as long as I've been around.
Knowing that my department and a lot of the other student media departments could be doing a lot of good for the university if we had the resources to do it. Knowing that we could be doing so much more on behalf of the students and the faculty and the entire campus if we were given those resources that could serve you guys better.
I think the one, there's 20 things, but one, so we can all get out of here, is, I'm trying to pick the one now. The thing that, when I talk to students, especially students who aren't majors, who aren't journalism majors, who are taking a journalism course because they need it for a requirement, I say that the hardest thing that they're gonna have to do is talk to strangers. Is to go up to somebody, usually cold, right? Or sometimes you send an email ahead of time and you're saying, look, I'd like to talk to you about this particular topic, right? For some people, they never get past the capacity to talk to folks, to talk to strangers, right? Me, I'll talk to anybody, man. Like I'll be getting my oil changed and whoever's sitting next to me, right? I'm just like, asking them about their lives. I'm nosy, right? I like to know, what other people are thinking and going through and talking about. Sometimes it's bad because sometimes people are not feeling it. But that competency, I think, journalism education really distills a lot of competencies. Again, the ability to kind of translate information quickly into a public-facing product. I think that anybody in any field needs that competency. I think a second in line there is talking to strangers and getting them to talk about either things that they don't want to talk about, right? People in power always, right? Or getting somebody to discuss an experience or something that's happened to them in a way that they're comfortable discussing, but that also is going to resonate publicly in a useful way. I think that is a skill that, again, a lot of different disciplines and jobs and experiences in the world are going to kind of call upon you to do. And pulling that Band-Aid off while you're in a journalism class in college, I think, and failing at it. I was terrible at it. I was I'd be shaking, right? And then you get more confident doing it, and I think it's just such a useful thing because you learn so much just about kind of how other people live and how other people's minds work. And I think that, I don't know, I feel like everybody has that gene. Everybody, we're social beings, and we want to know what's going through other people's minds and what they think and what they feel, right? Even if they're radically different from us politically, obviously right now is the big dividing line. I mean, it really should be class, it should be economic, right? But it's always blue or red, at this point. But kind of getting into their heads and kind of understanding where they're coming from, I think is really the thing that it's the hardest thing, it's the most difficult thing to do, but it's also, I think, the most rewarding skill you can develop.
And then you guys have just one question to kind of wrap us up?
Okay, so you guys talked a lot about being informed voters. So I guess my question is, what would be a great first step to becoming an informed voter?
Read, I'd say read a lot, right? Party affiliations give you a sense of where people are generally positioning themselves ideologically. And I think that especially now, I feel like things have become so polarized, the way that politics and the media have really fed into this polarization. But I think that you can gain some by watching, you can gain some by listening, but by actually kind of diving into issues, not just about candidate platforms, but about the things that are important to you and understanding what you want, whether that's clean water, right, more equitable distribution of monetary resources, right, fewer prisons, whatever your kind of thing is, right, finding that, and then, going to, the thing that people don't realize is people who are running for office hold town hall meetings all the time, and they are desperate for people to come and ask them questions. And if you can, go and kind of represent the opinion of a constituency or saying what are you going to do about X, Y, or Z, I think that's an incredibly useful thing to do. I mean, you have to vote, but voting's really only part of it. Being a more holistic kind of participant in kind of social life, political life, I think is really the most important thing. And I think that boils down to, for me, I'm a reader. And so, reading up on not just the candidates, but the issues, and then kind of trying to match things up in that regard.
I'll also add to that, you can also just contact that what's, you know, what some of the things are you passionate about, and then address that to the whole commission or board or whatever. Because it's a school board meeting. It's something where you're from and you graduated, but this situation is happening in your school district. Go there and speak as an alumni, address the school board. So there's a lot of ways, and just because they're like an elected official, mayor or something like that, you know, you can't talk to them. They're not this like unreachable person, you know.
Here's my method that I did when I was in the beginning, and I think, correct me if you think that this is not the wisest thing, but I would always, if there was a big event that would happen, I would find a news outlet that is traditionally one side of the aisle, and then I would find immediately after that a news outlet from the other side of the aisle. And if I was getting conflicting reports from both, I knew that I needed to do further research before I gained an opinion on the situation. But if they were on the same page, then I could more or less easy mode say, okay, this is something that's more clearly defined. Would you agree with that strategy for first-timers?
Yeah, I definitely think that's a good place to start.
It's a good place to start.
Yeah.
I say, so I'll say ditto to both of them because they kind of took part of what I was going to say. I'll also say make being informed fun. Find a way to enjoy staying in the loop and forming opinions on things. I know for me, I'm a media nerd, so I really enjoy when something big happens, like doing what Kyle said and like looking what's happening, how people are reporting on both sides of the bias spectrum or how different outlets cover different things. We live in an era where news and staying informed is multimedia. So if you're not a big fan of reading a news article in a newspaper, if you have an issue with that, see me after this. But if you don't enjoy that, if reading's not your thing, pick up a podcast. There's lots of short form video content on YouTube, which is all free. It's spectacular. Even mainstream news outlets have their own podcast videos. Even sometimes there are locations where you can go around town to be informed. Like we said, town halls, things to be an engaged voter. Find something that suits you. I mean, we're not asking you all to be a fan of one medium or the other, but find something that you enjoy, because that's going to make doing what would be considered research a lot more enjoyable. It's a great way to form opinions on things.
And I would just say you can also come into the CSLC. These are conversations that we have every single day in our office, so we're always willing to just sit down and chat, and we have coffee and snacks. So I know, it's a great place to be, guys, I'm just saying. Okay, great. So thank you guys all for coming. I want to thank our panelists really quick, so join me in thanking them. You guys have evaluations on your table, so please fill those out before you leave. And remember, our peer mentors are here if you guys need any help. But other than that, thank you for coming, and enjoy fall break. And we'll see you back here next week from 12 to 1 for a panel on the Freedom of Information Act and from a student's perspective. So thank you guys. Thank you. Thank you guys. Thank you guys.
Who's doing the FOIA?